Jacelyn Collins. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the communication accommodation theory. So I'm going to go over what it is and how often it is used. Okay, so the communication accommodation theory in its entirety states that we adjust our speech patterns, our vocal patterns, as well as our body language in order to communicate with other people on a day-to-day basis. So the theory was made up by Howard Giles in 1971 as he researched his own different theory for a social experiment of his own. He came up with this theory because he was doing his own social theory, and while he was noticing some of the similarities, he decided that this was actually a theory that he would later on go to write himself. So there are some major components of the theory. Two of the major ones are divergence and convergence, as well as over-accommodation. So for over-accommodation, you can actually use those for either convergence or divergence. So you can over-accommodate your convergence theory or your divergence theory. So let's get into what those actually mean. So convergence is how we adapt. So say for instance, I was speaking to an old person or elderly person. I wouldn't communicate with them the same way I would with one of my friends or my peers. I would communicate with them more respectful tone, a more respectful manner. As well as if I was speaking to a little kid, I wouldn't speak to them as well as I would speak to a friend. I would speak to them as they are, a child. I have an example here. Here in this day and age, as teenagers are taking over, they are using a lot more emojis in their text messages, and they understand it more. They are more able to communicate through pictures, whereas people of another generation are not. So use this example. She's using emojis to communicate with her friend, and this friend is in turn using emojis as well. And that is an example of convergence. Divergence is the opposite effect. So, for instance, if I were speaking to a child, I normally wouldn't speak to them like an adult, but for instance, convergence or divergence, you would actually do that. So, if I were speaking to a group of friends and an elderly person walked by, if I was disrespectful to them, that's actually divergence. And it's not that we mean to be, it's just sometimes that's how the communication goes. So, for instance, with the doctor's office, doctors are known as educated people. They have highly educated focus groups, and so they communicate completely different with normal people. On a day-to-day basis, they will go over so much terminology that they kind of blank as to what they're saying towards us. Normally, as an individual who has no knowledge of what medical terms are, we pretend that we do, but reality is we'll go home and Google it. But it's because they used big terms for us. So that's divergence. Over-accommodation can be used with either one. It's more often used in convergence. So for instance, this little baby here. When you think of a little baby and you think of someone talking to their baby, you think of the goo goo gaga, oh, you're so cute, little baby talk that they do. Well, it's actually pretty patronizing towards babies. Now, they don't normally say anything, obviously, but it is pretty demeaning towards young children, especially if they are more educated than you're giving them credit for. So real quick, I'm going to show you guys a video to show the theory in its action.
Morning, Mom. Yes, it is, Minister.
So in that video, so in the video, we have a couple different examples. So if you notice, she changed her voice entirely in order to speak to her mother-in-law. That is an example of the theory in its process. So she is using convergence for not just one conversation, but actually for two conversations. She is using convergence to speak to her mother-in-law in the way that she would prefer to be spoken to, which is that really, strong accent, manner, and that's how they communicate, I'm assuming, in their home. With her husband, she's displaying a totally different convergence theory for that conversation. She would never speak to her husband that way. She'll only speak to him in the kind manner that he knows her as. So overall, the theory in that video would be convergence in its finest, as well as over accommodation, because she did go to such an extremity for her vocal patterns. So do you guys have any questions? All right, well, then that would conclude my video, and let me show the audience. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this.